The vanishing case that terrified investigators. The first call landed at 9:12 p.m. on a drizzly Thursday along Highway 22, where the road slips past the dark water of Detroit Lake and into the timber that locals simply call the Ridge. The caller's voice was steady, then it wasn't. "My name is Evan Mercer," he said, breath shallow like he'd just jogged. "I pulled over at the mile marker with the broken green sign, the one with the bullet holes. There's... Hold on," Static hissed. A soft scrape, like a jacket sleeve, brushed against the phone. "There's someone in the trees. They're not moving right. They're not walking, they're not." The line crackled, then went silent for 3 long seconds. When the dispatcher asked him to repeat, Evan said, "Quieter. If I don't answer in a minute, please send someone. Please hurry." The call ended with a wet clicking sound, as if a tongue tapped the microphone, and nothing more. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Patrol car 3 King 7 reached the pullout at 9:27 p.m. and found an old F-150 idling with the driver's door ajar. The overhead light was on, and a thermos steamed faintly in the cup holder. A phone lay face down on the passenger seat, recording a 9-minute voice memo that the deputy, a calm woman named Lena Alvarez, downloaded on the spot. Her body camera caught everything. The first minute was just engine, rain, and a bright pulsing hum too low to be a siren. The rest was the sound of the forest taking slow breaths. Detective Rowan Hale arrived from the county office at 10:04 p.m., the kind of investigator who carried a metal tape measure and wrote times down to the second. He stood in the beam of his cruiser, a pale rectangle of light on wet asphalt, and listened to the lake pushing softly at the rocky shore below. Pines crowded the slope, black spears against a wool sky. The smell of hot engine blended with a sharp metallic odor, like a coin pressed hard to the tongue. "Mercer?" he called. The trees said nothing. They found footprints immediately. Evan stepped out of his truck in work boots, size 11, crossing the gravel shoulder toward the tree line. The rain softened the edges, but every other detail was crisp. Heel, arch, toe. Then the prints did something that made both investigators forget to breathe for a beat. They simply ended. Not faded, not scuffed away, stopped. The last print lay in the gravel mid-stride, the tiny stones within it undisturbed, as if the boot had pressed into powder that wasn't there, lifted, and left no next step. "Could be," he hopped, Deputy Alvarez whispered, not believing it. "Where to?" Hale said, and lifted his flashlight. The beam scanned the wet trunks. 10 feet in, a birch peeled a silver ribbon of bark. Farther back, the forest went so dark, the light seemed to fall into it. No dragging marks, no sliding mud, no impression of knees or hands, just the last step and the next step missing. At 10:22 p.m., the tow truck driver, a night owl named Beasley, who moved like he was always recovering from the last thing he saw, holstered his gloves and crossed himself when he looked at the prints. He said it without looking at the woods. "This place eats things." The search started by 11. State troopers, county volunteers, 2 SAR handlers with dogs, one named Gipper, the other Foxy, both usually eager to barrel into brush. They took one sniff of the air and sat. Not frightened exactly, braced, as if whatever their noses told them was both confusing and beneath their notice. When the handlers coaxed them forward, the dogs went a few yards into the trees, stopped at the last footprint, and stared at a point 3 feet above the ground, tails flat, heads tilted in the same uncanny angle as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. At 12:17 a.m., a deputy radioed a report of dim white lights flickering deeper in the trees. Hale and Alvarez pushed in to check. What they found was stranger than flashlights. 3 lengths of mylar, the kind used for emergency blankets, were snagged high on branches and rustled as the wind shifted. Their reflective surfaces shivered with every gust, throwing off weak glints like eyes. But there were no footprints beneath the trees they hung from, no sign anyone had climbed to place them. Hale measured the height with his stick. The lowest strip was more than 10 feet up. They set a perimeter anyway. They marked the last print with a yellow tent labeled A. The truck was taken back to the county lot by 1:05 a.m. Its cabin still warm, its radio presets set to classic rock, and a local AM station that would rattle with a sports talk show at noon. A coffee receipt in the cup holder said 8. 41 Pendemen, Cedar Mart, 2 miles east in the town of Gray Ridge. Population stitched together by the mill and the lake. The cashier on duty, a college kid named Jude, remembered Evan saying he needed caffeine for the drive back to Salem. He remembered Evan glancing toward the door as if someone had just passed by the glass. He looked spooked, Jude said at 1:53 a.m., sitting in a back office under buzzing fluorescent lights, steam rising from his instant noodles. Like when you see your reflection move the wrong way. The next morning broke flat and gray. The mountains wore a low band of cloud, the kind that never quite lifts. The wider team assembled at a trailhead with paper cups of donated coffee and stale sugar donuts, then fanned out in grids. That was when the first investigator said out loud that something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't superstition, it was a physical sensation, the way you notice silence only when it feels like weight. They kept finding things that should have belonged to Evan, except they couldn't prove they did. A key on a ring with no car fob wedged in moss. A strip of duct tape stuck to a rock, perfectly smooth as if it had never touched anything. A silver coin embedded in the mud so deeply that the date stamped on it had been polished smooth by grinding it against nothing. They also found a smear on a tree, low and oval and faintly oily to the touch, like a thumbprint the size of a dinner plate. The lab in Salem would later say it contained petroleum byproducts, cedar pollen, and something else not identified in their standard panel. The technician who gave that report sniffed and said the something else was probably an environmental contaminant, which was the exact phrasing a person uses when they want to be done thinking about what they touched. At 2:03 p.m., Alvarez went into the grocery on Main Street to talk to a woman named Mara Ellison, who held a paper cup in both hands as if she were trying to warm bone. He texted me at 8:47, she said, passing over her phone with the threads. The message read, "I'm fine, just grabbed coffee. The lake's got that weird low fog. It sits like it's thinking." Then at 9:06, "There's a green sign. Wind is kicking up. I hear something and then nothing else." She had called at 9:20 when he didn't answer. "He doesn't ghost me," she said, and the way she said it told them everything. Hale asked what Evan did for work. He managed a small warehouse, took weekend trips to fish, paid his bills on time, kept a list in his phone of guitar chords that sounded good after midnight. He wasn't running from anyone. He wasn't trying to disappear. He had a dent in his truck door that he still hadn't fixed because he said it made the truck look honest. He laughed at bad jokes and bought extra firewood for friends at campouts. That evening, he'd been headed home from a helper job at a friend's cabin on the far side of the lake. A normal day, nothing magic in it until it was. The traffic camera at mile marker 142 was an old unit bolted to a leaning pole, its feed flowing into a state server that an IT tech in Salem could pull within minutes. At 4:11 p.m., Hale and Alvarez sat in a dim room at the sheriff's office while the techs scrubbed back and forth across a sliver of time. 9:19 p.m. showed the edge of Evan's truck. 19:41 showed the door opening. At 9:19:52, a tall figure stepped into frame. At the bottom edge of the image, head bent, shoulders bunched against rain. At 19:57, every pixel on the screen seemed to drag left by a hair as if the world had been pulled in a single direction and then let go. It wasn't a full glitch, the time code didn't skip, the sound didn't break. It looked like heat shimmer but there was no heat. A moment later, the figure was gone. "Frame drop," the tech said, and then frowning, "except it isn't." He tapped keys, there's no missing data, the codec logged a continuous packet stream. He didn't like saying that. Sometimes these older units get interference. He made a show of checking for lightning strikes that never happened and solar activity that wasn't present either. When he left, the small room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, and Hale wrote the time down again, because writing times was how he kept a grip on what the world was supposed to do. The word for what the case did to investigators began as tired jokes. Maybe we should start charging the ghosts rent. By the third night, nobody joked. The third night was when Alvarez lost 41 seconds. It was 2:13 a.m. when she walked alone down the shoulder of the highway, past the pullout, body cam glowing a neat blue bead in the dark. The rain had thinned to mist that glittered in her beam. She narrated for the record the way they are trained. Alvarez walking southbound, wind negligible, pavement wet, no vehicles, audible lake wash to my left, smell of cedar. It's cold. Then she stopped speaking because she heard it. The hum. It was not electricity, it was not a plane, it was the noise a taut cable makes when the wind plucks it. It vibrated in her teeth. Her beam swung once across the trees and came back to the road, and then the video blurred, not in a smear, but in a folding. The yellow center line ahead of her looked like a ribbon being drawn into the woods, little key stitches of paint bending toward the trunks and then releasing. She took one more step and had the sensation of putting her foot down into air that did not expect it. The video never cut, the timestamp never jumped, but her voice, steadily narrating, was gone for 41 full seconds, replaced by soft rooftops of sound like waves falling over a gravel bar. When the sound of her voice returned, she was saying, "No, I'm good, I'm right here," and her breath was hitching. She stood on the shoulder with her hands braced on her knees, and the night came back in layers, wind in the mylar strips, a truck rumbling faintly miles away. Her own pulse drumming so loud inside her ears, it sounded like someone knocking from the inside of a closet. "You okay?" Hale said, moving to her, and she nodded too fast. She wouldn't describe what she saw fully for a day. When she finally did, she said it in a low, even tone at the end of a long interview. "The road tilted," she said. "Not the pavement, not the earth, the place where you decide which way to step. It tilted toward the trees. If something wanted a clean line, it would wipe the line you chose, and you'd walk into where nothing has a step." The case file swelled with interviews, maps, lists. Hale added a page about an earlier disappearance that the old-timers mentioned only if you prompted them with dates. A logger named Kenner went missing in roughly the same stretch, back when the mill still paid cash at the end of the week and the tavern stayed open until sunrise. According to a man named Fielder, who kept a ledger of local deaths because the county clerk's office was a 50-minute drive, Kenner's truck had also been found idling with its lights on and his lunch pail still latched. The printout with an excerpt from that ledger became tab 23. In pencil, Hale wrote in the margin, "Pattern." By day 5, the search scaled down. It always does. People have jobs, fuel costs, the lake never stops pushing at the rocks, and even grief must sleep. Yet every night at 2-something in the morning, the AM band on the radio at the sheriff's office shivered into a non-signal, a dead station that rattled. When you turn the dial through it, the numbers 739 seemed to whisper past in sequence 3 or 4 times. Not a full voice, just a cadence. The repairs crew came in and tightened everything, and the sound came back anyway. Then, a small thing that got under everyone's skin. A janitor named Ruth found the chain from Evan's keyring lying on the tile in the hallway outside the evidence room one morning when she came in a few minutes before sunrise. It was the cheap kind of chain made of tiny balls. It had a small kink in it that Mara later said she recognized, and the link that would have held a fob was bent, as if someone had tried and failed to add a key in a hurry. The inventory log showed the keyring inside the sealed bag inside the locked cabinet. The bag weighed the same, looked the same, sat exactly where it should have been, and when they opened it, the chain was intact and the kink was where Mara remembered. The chain in the hall, same length, same feel, sat on Hale's desk in a small dish for the rest of the month, and people avoided looking at it because it was easier to pretend that kind of duplication belonged to a mistake. At 10:13 p.m. on day 7, a man drifting a small aluminum boat along the north shore of the lake called in a sighting. He said a white shape moved among the trees near the mile marker, a pale figure gliding parallel to the shore and then stopping. He rowed closer. The shape was a refrigerator box, flayed open on one side and flapping in the breeze, caught between trunks. When officers hauled it out, they found the inside lined with, of all things, pages from a guitar chord book glued into a collage of E minor and D7 and A4. Every page split and overlapped so that none of the chords formed a full diagram. The paper was dry. Hale wrote the time down anyway. He did not say anything about the list in Evan's phone of chords he liked after midnight. Night 9 was when it turned personal enough to break the last of the gallows humor. Hale woke in his room at the Cedar Motor Lodge at 2:16 a.m. to the soft hum. It vibrated the window glass. He sat up and put his feet on the carpet and felt the pressure in the air as if a storm were about to hit. The red numbers of the clock read 2:17. He stood, crossed to the sink, and turned on the tap for noise, then turned it off again because the water came out in staccato bursts like it was remembering how to be water. The chain on his door clicked once with no one touching it. He would not write that in the report because even he had a line he didn't want to cross. But he wrote the time, 2:18. He stared at the door long enough to hear the people next door whispering through thin drywall. A woman's voice said, "Don't say it out loud," and a man's voice said, "We didn't." By then, Gray Ridge's rumor mill was grinding full speed. The woman who ran the pie shop on Main told anyone who would listen that she had driven past that mile marker around 10 p.m. the week before and watched her dashboard clock stutter backward from 10, 7 to 10, 5, and then tick forward again like a skip in a record. A youth pastor from the church near the school said he'd hiked the ridge years ago and felt his legs tremble in a patch of sunlight that shouldn't have been there because the canopy was too dense. A retired surveyor named Orville talked about a singing wire he'd heard when he was a young man stringing telephone lines, the kind of sound that makes your fillings itch. He said the ridge had its own weather. He said not to whistle there at night. He said a lot of things, and then he said nothing at all and rocked gently on his heels. 2 weeks in, the official search scaled down again. The case file thickened with the weight of pages you only read when you have to. Hale kept going to the lake at night. He wore the same heavy jacket, ate the same vending machine granola bar, and wrote times as if each time could anchor a thing that didn't want to be held. At 1:59 a.m. On one of those nights, he measured the distance from the last print to the first tree 3 times and got 3 different numbers. Not different by much, by 1.5 inches, by 2 inches, by 9/16. The kind of differences that make you double-check your hands. He measured a length of rope along the shoulder, 250 feet, and when he rolled it back up, his hands were shaking so badly that the rope slipped, and he had to start again. When he measured it the second time, it was missing 11 inches. He cut a new piece from a fresh spool and measured again. 250 feet on the nose. He did not put the 11-inch short rope in the evidence room. He kept it in his trunk because he didn't want to know what the evidence room would do with it. On a quiet afternoon in the 3rd week, the county received a voicemail stamped with the date of the night Evan vanished and delivered by the network 3 weeks late. The message came to Mara's phone first, then was forwarded to the sheriff. It was short, wind in a speaker, the sound of a shoe scuffing gravel. A man's voice, breathless but not panicked, saying, "Do not step or you cannot hear your feet." and then a singular knock, as if a knuckle had tapped an empty wooden box. The line ended on a small intake of breath, cut clean. The carrier said towers sometimes backlog, messages sometimes float in the system, and there was nothing more they could explain. At 3:23 p.m., one day, a volunteer named Naomi Pike, who wrote about strange disappearances for a small website and had the polite eyes of someone who knows when she's not wanted, brought photocopies of old news clippings about the lake before it became the lake. Down Valley communities flooded. Whole stands of trees drowned when the dam closed and the water rose. Stoves and fence posts and tomato cages at the bottom of a mild, cold sea. One article quoted an older ranger, long dead now, muttering on record that the ridge made compasses slow. Naomi handed everything over without flourish and went back to her rental car. Her taillights glowed red against the rain as she pulled away, then dissolved into gray. The same afternoon, the state tech sent an email about the traffic camera feed saying he'd found tiny backlog in the buffer at 19 that night. A few extra kilobytes whispering through the stream. Nothing meaningful. Just noise. Harmless, he wrote. Artifact of packet repair. He added a smiley face. When Hale read that line, he stood abruptly, walked outside into the wind, and stood under the bare flagpole until the wind cut his eyes and he felt calmer. There were more calls at night. A man who swore he saw a figure standing in the shallow wash at the lake's edge, looking out at the black water. Both hands raised like he was warming them over a fire no one else could see. A pair of night fishermen who heard a voice say hello from just behind them and then repeat it in a lower octave, as if two throats had learned the word together. Two teenagers who parked at the pullout and joked loudly to keep brave until they noticed all the night insects had gone silent at once, as if a hand had pressed down on a switch, and they drove away so fast they forgot to switch on their headlight. Then, one more thing that turned the case from frightening to personal for the people wearing the badges. At 2:31 a.m., the day before the file was supposed to be transferred to a colder desk, Alvarez was typing up a supplemental when her monitor blinked black and came back with a blinking cursor inside a blank report she had not opened. The cursor jumped on its own. A single word appeared in the field where the case name should go. Here. Then nothing, and the monitor returned to her report as if she had never left it. She stared until the clock at the bottom corner ticked over to 2:33. She saved her report, closed the lid, and felt her throat press shut like a hand had rested around it. She signed off early and drove to the lake. She stopped 100 yards short of the pullout. She turned off her lights and sat in the dark, listening. She did not get out. She did not press record. She did not narrate. She did not breathe for a count of 4. After a minute, she heard the softest sound, like boot leather bending, as someone shifted their weight from one foot to the other. She thought, with sudden clarity, that the worst part of this job had never been the blood or the lies. It was the moments when you knew you were hearing something meant for you. By dawn, she made a decision. She told Hale 2 hours later, standing beside the coffee machine while it groaned out a thin stream. I can't do nights there anymore, she said. Not for a while. He nodded as if she had told him the sky had a color. He signed the form that moved her temporarily to day shifts and wrote the time, 10:21 a. He would tell his wife later that he had never been proud of a signature before. Officially, the Mercer case never reached a conclusion. The file thickened and then stopped. The press releases used phrases like pending new information and no evidence of foul play found at this time, which is what you write when every possibility has crawled under the bed to hide from daylight. People still drive past the green sign with the bullet holes, and at night they glance in their mirrors between mile markers 141 and 143 without knowing why. The strange part isn't how it ended. The strange part is how it kept touching things after it should have gone still. Months later, a family walking the shoreline in April found a sealed jar in a tangle of drift close to the pullout. Inside, folded tight, was a page torn neatly from a spiral notebook. The page was blank at first glance. Only when they tilted it toward the sun did they see faint writing impressed into the paper, as if someone had written on a page above it and the pressure left ghosts of letters. It read, in sharp, ordinary handwriting, "Never step where sound has left." The letters walked down the page and thinned at the end. The jar lid was on tight. There was no water inside. The family turned the jar in to the county without their names. The clerk who accepted it put it on a shelf to be logged after lunch. When she came back, the jar was gone, and in its place sat a silver coin pressed so clean you couldn't read the date. On some nights, if you tune your car radio to the broken AM station near the lake, the dial will tremble as you pass that stretch, and a low thrumming will pulse through the speakers like the space between heartbeats. A voice, maybe the same voice that warned the dispatcher, maybe not, will rise out of static for just a moment. You won't catch the words. You'll only feel your feet on the pedals, your hands on the wheel, and the peculiar awareness that you are crossing a place where the world forgets its lines. Keep driving. Keep your tires on the painted edge. Count out loud if you have to. Hear your step. And if you stop, if you ease onto the gravel and lower your window and listen, the night will offer you the gentle wash of the lake, the whisper of wind through fir needles, and that thin cable hum plucked by nothing human. You will think about a man who stepped toward the trees with his shoulders hunched against rain. You will look down and see your own footprint, clean in the grit, and you will see that there is a space ahead of it where the next print should go and does not. Your mind will fill the blank with stories, so you can move. Choose one, make it a good one, bring it with you as you turn back to the wheel. Drive. The ridge will watch you leave and fold the sound of your engine carefully away, as if it has been saving a quiet place for it all along. Some cases terrified because of what they show you. This one terrifies because of what it takes away, one step at a time, until the distance between footsteps becomes a place all its own. When the investigators finally closed their notebooks and turned off their recorders, the lake kept breathing. The ridge kept humming. And somewhere, just past the broken green sign, the last clear footprint in the gravel waited under a thin coat of dust for the next person who leaned too close to the line where the world forgets to make the next step. When ordinary nights turned into real-life nightmares, the evening had been calm, almost too calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was late autumn, when the days shortened quickly and the cold crept in long before the sun had completely disappeared. The small town of Pine Hollow, tucked between stretches of woodland and winding rivers, was the kind of place where people locked their doors out of habit rather than fear. For years, nothing truly terrible had happened here, and that quiet sense of safety was exactly what made what followed so disturbing. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Thursday night, just past 9, the streets were nearly empty. A few porch lights glowed faintly, and the sound of televisions drifted from living rooms where families settled in after dinner. The air smelled of damp leaves, and a thin mist curled along the edges of the forest that surrounded the town. It was on nights like this that people usually felt comfort in routine, yet beneath that surface calm, something unnatural was already stirring. At the edge of town stood a narrow road that led into the trees, a road most people avoided at night. Locals had stories about headlights flickering there or shadows darting between the trees when no one should have been around. On that particular night, a delivery driver heading home swore he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slowed down, blinking his headlights, but when he drew closer, the figure had vanished. Shaken, he pulled over, convinced for a moment that his mind was playing tricks. But the mist was heavy, and as he sat there listening to the engine idle, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the asphalt. Yet, no one was there. Back in town, around the same time, a group of teenagers was gathered in the old baseball field near the high school. They were laughing, tossing around a football under the dim glow of the single floodlight that still worked. The grass was wet with dew, and the chill forced them to keep moving. One of them paused, looking toward the tree line. A faint, rhythmic knocking sound was coming from the woods. At first, they thought it was an animal. Then, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone rapping wood against wood in a steady beat. They yelled into the darkness, expecting maybe another friend playing a prank, but the sound didn't stop. It moved closer, circling them, until the floodlight above suddenly flickered and went out. The field was swallowed by darkness, and in that instant, all of them ran. Later, when they told their parents, no one believed them. That same night, just after midnight, a young couple living in a small apartment above Main Street awoke to the sound of knocking on their door. At first, they ignored it, thinking it might be someone who had the wrong apartment. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more insistent, louder, and then turned into pounding. The man grabbed a flashlight, went to the door, and called out, but no voice answered. He hesitated before looking through the peephole. What he saw made his stomach twist. There was no one there, yet the pounding continued, echoing through the hallway. Suddenly, the noise stopped, replaced by silence so complete it pressed against his ears. He opened the door cautiously, sweeping the flashlight across the empty hall. The bulb in the overhead light had burned out, and the shadows stretched long. He was about to step back inside when he noticed something smeared across the doorframe. A set of handprints, damp and dark, as though someone had pressed their palms into the wood. By dawn, the town felt different. People were whispering in cafes, parents were checking in on their children, and the sheriff's phone rang nonstop with reports of strange occurrences. Lights flickering in houses, voices heard in empty rooms, shadows appearing at the edge of vision. The sheriff himself, a man hardened by years of quiet service, tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, yet he too had woken in the night to find every clock in his house stopped at exactly 3:15. The following night, the atmosphere thickened, streetlights dimmed for no reason, radios filled with static, and dogs across Pine Hollow began to howl in unison. At the small gas station on the corner of Maple Street, the cashier was closing up when he heard what he thought was someone calling his name from the restroom. He checked, but the restroom was empty. When he returned to the counter, every shelf in the store had shifted, cans and bottles rearranged into patterns that looked like circles. He quit his job the very next morning. The town's sense of safety began to erode quickly. Parents kept their children indoors, doors were bolted, and even then, the nights became unbearable. People reported nightmares so vivid they woke up screaming, describing the same thing over and over. A tall shadow, faceless and thin, standing at the foot of their beds, waiting. Some said it whispered their names, others said it only stood in silence, yet all of them swore it was real. By the third night, the sheriff organized patrols, hoping that extra eyes on the streets would calm everyone down. But even his deputies admitted that strange things were happening. Radios cut out mid-transmission, squad cars stalled without explanation, and 2 officers swore they saw a figure crawling on all fours across the roof of a house before vanishing into the night. One of the most chilling events happened to a family on Cedar Lane. Just after 2 in the morning, their smoke alarm went off. The parents rushed through the house, searching for fire, but there was no smoke, no flames. Yet, when they entered their daughter's room, they found her standing by the window, wide awake, staring outside. When they asked what she was looking at, she pointed into the yard and said, "He's waiting." The parents looked, but saw nothing. Later, when they checked the yard in daylight, they found a set of footprints in the mud, leading up to the window, and then disappearing abruptly as though the figure had sunk into the earth. The nightmare spread, no one was spared. People reported hearing cries in the woods, whispers in their homes, and a constant feeling of being watched. Businesses closed early, church services filled with frightened families, and yet no explanation ever came. Scientists were called in from the city, trying to measure electromagnetic fields, looking for gas leaks, anything that might explain the mass hysteria. They left empty-handed, shaken themselves after spending one night in the town. One night, a heavy storm rolled through. Thunder shook the houses, rain hammered the rooftops, and the wind carried voices that seemed to call out from everywhere at once. Entire neighborhoods lost power. In that suffocating darkness, people saw things they would never forget. A woman walking her dog swore she saw dozens of pale hands pressing against the inside of her living room window, even though no one was inside. A truck driver passing through claimed he drove for nearly 20 miles without seeing another car, only to find the same broken-down vehicle appearing again and again on the roadside. By morning, Pine Hollow was not the same town. Ordinary nights had been replaced with nights of terror. People abandoned their homes, some never came back, and others stayed, but lived in constant fear. The sheriff eventually stopped taking reports, not because they stopped happening, but because there were too many. To this day, no one can explain what really descended on Pine Hollow. Some believe it was something ancient, tied to the land itself, awakened by chance. Others whisper it was a punishment, a darkness drawn to the town for reasons no one dares to speak. What remains are the memories, carved into the minds of those who lived through it, reminders that sometimes the most ordinary nights can twist into real-life nightmares, leaving scars that time cannot erase. And if you ever find yourself passing through Pine Hollow on a foggy night, with the streetlights flickering and the woods pressing close, you might feel it too, that sense of being watched. Perhaps you'll hear footsteps following your own, or a faint knock that seems to echo in your bones. And if you do, don't linger too long, because what once came for Pine Hollow may be waiting still, hidden in the mist, ready to turn another ordinary night into something you'll never forget. A murder mystery too twisted to solve. It was late evening when the wind began to stir through the quiet streets of a small town in northern America. The sky was heavy with clouds, the moon only occasionally breaking through, casting pale light over the narrow roads. In the distance, the sound of a church bell echoed faintly, almost swallowed by the cold air. At that very moment, no one realized that something dreadful was about to unfold, something that would haunt investigators and residents alike for years to come. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The town was the kind of place where everyone believed they knew each other. Houses stood close together, with porches that looked out toward empty sidewalks. Street lamps flickered as if struggling to keep their glow alive. It was just after 10 p.m. when the local police received a call that changed everything. A neighbor, shaken and out of breath, reported screams coming from the house at the corner of Willow Street. The screams were sharp, desperate, and then, suddenly, they stopped. When the first patrol car arrived, the neighborhood was already on edge. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and uneasy faces peeked out. The house in question stood silent, its front porch lights swinging in the wind as if someone had passed under it in a hurry. Officers knocked on the door but received no answer. After a tense moment, they forced their way inside. The interior of the house felt wrong immediately. A faint smell of iron filled the air, unmistakably metallic. The living room was dim, the lamp knocked over, casting eerie shadows across the walls. A half-finished cup of coffee still sat on the table, steam long gone, as if someone had been interrupted mid-sip. In the kitchen, chairs were overturned, one of them broken at the leg. And then, in the hallway, they found it. A body lying face down, blood pooled beneath. The victim had been struck repeatedly, the brutality suggesting rage more than intention. What made it all the more disturbing was the detail that none of the doors or windows had been forced open. Whoever did this had either been let inside willingly or was already in the house. By midnight, detectives were swarming the scene. One of them, a seasoned investigator who had seen his share of violence, admitted quietly that this case felt different, darker somehow. The victim's belongings were untouched, wallet and jewelry left behind, ruling out robbery. A series of photographs were discovered scattered on the floor, showing the victim with various friends and family. Yet, one photo stood out. It had been ripped in half, the missing piece showing only a shadow where another person had once been. The autopsy revealed something that sent chills even deeper. The injuries did not match a single weapon. It looked as though multiple methods had been used, almost ritualistic in nature. The coroner's report mentioned hesitation wounds, as if the killer had changed their mind halfway through, then continued with even greater force. As the investigation widened, the neighbors began sharing fragments of strange experiences. One elderly woman said she had noticed a tall figure standing across the street several nights in a row, unmoving, watching the house, disappearing before she could call anyone. Another resident swore they heard footsteps in their backyard at odd hours, though no one was ever found. Police combed through hours of surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic lights, but something bizarre kept happening. Whenever the suspect might have appeared on camera, the footage glitched. Frames skipped, figures blurred into unrecognizable smears, as though the very image resisted being captured. Weeks passed, and suspicion fell on several people close to the victim. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives were interrogated. Secrets began surfacing, revealing hidden grudges, financial troubles, and long-buried conflicts. But every lead seemed to collapse into nothing. Alibis checked out, motives were plausible but not conclusive, and physical evidence pointed in conflicting directions. The case grew colder, but the town itself did not rest easy. Strange calls began flooding the local police line. Residents reported hearing screams at night coming from empty lots. Others claimed they saw fleeting shadows darting across windows when no one was inside. Children woke crying, telling their parents they saw someone standing at the foot of their bed, someone tall with eyes that seemed hollow. Detectives tried to dismiss these claims as fear spreading in a shaken community, but even they could not deny what was happening during interviews. On more than one occasion, while questioning potential witnesses, the lights in the room flickered violently, and audio recorders captured faint whispers that no one present had spoken. The words were never clear, but one phrase repeated often enough to be noticed: "You can't find me." In one of the most unsettling turns, the original 911 call from the neighbor was revisited. When replayed, investigators realized that beneath the frantic voice, another sound lingered faintly. A whisper, distorted, almost laughing. Yet when the audio was enhanced, the voice vanished, replaced by static, as though the tape itself refused to give away its secret. By now, the community was spiraling into paranoia. People locked their doors earlier, kept lights on through the night, and avoided walking alone. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. Some swore they saw a figure in reflective surfaces, in mirrors and dark windows, a presence that always seemed one step out of reach. Despite the chilling atmosphere, the police continued piecing together what they could. A breakthrough seemed near when a small, blood-stained note was discovered in the lining of the victim's coat. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared, but it carried a single sentence that unsettled everyone who read it. It said simply, "You will never understand." This note sparked endless theories. Some believed the killer was mocking investigators. Others thought it was the victim's desperate attempt to leave a clue. But the handwriting matched no one in their circle, not even remotely. Months turned into years, and the case officially remained unsolved. Yet the file stayed open on the desks of those who worked it, haunting them like an unfinished puzzle. Detectives admitted privately that they sometimes dreamed of the crime scene, waking drenched in sweat, certain they had seen the shadow of the killer standing in their own bedroom. Even today, the house on Willow Street remains empty. The curtains are drawn, the yard overgrown, the structure slowly decaying. People avoid walking past it, crossing to the other side of the road. Children dare each other to step onto the porch, but rarely make it past the first stair. Those who do swear they feel a crushing heaviness in their chest, as though the house itself rejects their presence. Local folklore has grown around the case, transforming the murder into something larger, something darker. They say the killer was never meant to be caught, that it was less a person and more a force, something that feeds on confusion and fear. Others insist the victim themselves was not innocent, that secrets buried in that house led to an ending too twisted for the living to fully grasp. Whatever the truth may be, the murder mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Because in the silence of that house, in the flicker of those failing street lamps, and in the restless dreams of those who remember, something still lingers, waiting, watching, daring anyone to try and unravel what cannot be explained. And each time the wind passes through the broken windows of Willow Street, carrying with it a low and hollow whistle, the town is reminded that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some truths are too twisted to face, and some killers may still be out there unseen, yet never gone. The town that hid its darkest secret. The road into the small town was always quiet at night. A narrow strip of cracked asphalt cutting through endless fields of corn that swayed beneath the pale glow of the moon. Travelers who passed by would often remark how the place seemed frozen in time, as though the decades had moved on everywhere else but here. The welcome sign, chipped and leaning slightly to the right, greeted visitors with fading letters declaring the name of the town proudly, though few outsiders ever stopped long enough to remember it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It was just past midnight when the first unsettling incident began. A thin mist rolled in from the nearby river, curling low against the ground and weaving between the wooden houses that lined the main street. Most of the town was asleep, curtains drawn tight, doors locked, as though the residents all shared the same unspoken understanding that nothing good ever happened after dark. On the far edge of town, a lone diner sat glowing beneath buzzing neon lights. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. A handful of locals sat scattered across the booths, their conversations hushed, eyes occasionally drifting toward the wide windows that looked out into the night. The bell above the door rang, and for a moment, the entire diner fell silent. A man stepped in, his face pale and clothes damp, as though he had walked straight through the mist itself. Without speaking, he slid into a booth near the back, his trembling hands clasped around a worn leather bag. The waitress, a middle-aged woman who had worked there her whole life, poured him coffee without asking. She glanced down at the bag, then back at his face, and for the briefest moment, her expression hardened, as if she recognized something no one else could. She leaned close, whispering words too low for anyone else to hear, and the man nodded slowly. Whatever passed between them left the other customers uneasy. They pretended to focus on their meals, but the tension in the room was undeniable. At 3 a.m, the church bell rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound carried across the town, deep and hollow, waking those who had been resting fitfully in their beds. Curtains were parted, lights flicked on, and whispers spread through the night air like sparks in dry grass. The bell was never supposed to ring at that hour, not since the tragedy that had taken place long ago. People knew it, and yet no one dared step outside to check. By dawn, the mist had lifted, but unease clung to the town like a shadow. Children walked to school with their parents close by, every set of eyes watching the empty church tower at the center of town. The man from the diner was nowhere to be found. The booth he had sat in was empty, though the waitress swore she had watched him walk toward the back door before the bell had rung. His coffee cup remained on the table, the liquid inside now stone cold, but the bag was gone. For days, whispers filled the town. Some said the man had been part of the old families, the ones who had lived here since the town's founding, before records were kept properly. Others swore he carried evidence of what had really happened during the fire that destroyed half the town square decades ago. The fire had always been explained as an accident, but deep down, many suspected there was more to it. The town rebuilt quickly, too quickly, and certain names disappeared from records, erased as if they had never existed. On the third night, more strange events began. Lights flickered in homes closest to the church. A dog howled relentlessly at shadows that no one else could see. In the cemetery behind the churchyard, fresh soil was found disturbed, though no burials had been scheduled. The caretaker insisted nothing had been touched, but his voice shook as he said it. By the end of the week, fear had settled in the bones of the townsfolk. The local sheriff tried to calm people down, holding a meeting in the old hall near the river. Lanterns cast long, flickering shadows on the walls as neighbors gathered, their voices rising with anger and fear. Some demanded answers about the bell, others accused each other of hiding the truth. The sheriff raised his hand for silence, and when the room finally grew quiet, he told them flatly that there were things in this town better left buried. His words hung in the air like a curse. But the younger ones weren't satisfied. A group of curious residents decided they had to see for themselves what the church was hiding. That night, under a cloudy sky that threatened rain, they crept into the churchyard with flashlights and nervous laughter that faded quickly into silence. The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned as they pushed them open, the stale smell of dust and mildew washing over them. Inside, the pews were covered in sheet. The strange death that defied all logic. It was late November in a quiet rural town in Virginia. The air carried the smell of burning wood from fireplaces, the skies darkened early, and long shadows stretched across the empty roads. People were preparing for the winter season, stacking firewood, closing shutters against the cold wind, and settling into their nightly routines. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual until a call came into the sheriff's office just after 10 at night. A man had been found dead inside his own home under circumstances so bizarre that even seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the strangest cases they had ever seen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The house stood on the edge of town, an old two-story farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Locals often passed by it and commented on its lonely appearance, the way the shutters rattled even when there was no wind, and how the light in the upstairs window sometimes flickered long past midnight. The man who lived there was known by many in town. He was not the type who kept close friends, but he was not disliked either. People described him as polite, quiet, and occasionally eccentric. No one ever expected his name to be tied to one of the most haunting investigations the county would ever face. The discovery was made by a neighbor who noticed that the man's truck had not moved for 2 days, and the porch light had been left on since the weekend. When no one answered repeated knocks on the door, the neighbor called authorities. Deputies arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the cold air as they walked up the creaking porch steps. The front door was locked. Yet when they pushed gently, it gave way with a strange groan, as if it had already been forced from the inside. The scene inside was unsettling from the start. The living room looked untouched, a stack of unopened mail sat neatly on the table, and the fireplace had gone cold. But as the officers moved deeper into the house, they were hit with a wave of unease. The air felt heavy, as if charged with something unseen. Upstairs, the hall was lined with old family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the deputies' every step. They reached the bedroom at the end of the hall, and what they found there was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The man was lying on his bed, but not in the way one might expect. His body was arranged in a rigid, almost ceremonial position, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling in frozen terror. His mouth was twisted into a silent scream, lips cracked as though he had been gasping for air. The blankets beneath him were undisturbed, tucked neatly under his body, suggesting he had not struggled or moved before death. It looked as if he had simply laid down and been struck by an invisible force that drained the life out of him instantly. The strangest detail was the expression on his face. It was not just fear, it was beyond fear. It was as if he had seen something impossible, something no human mind was meant to comprehend. The deputies stood frozen for a moment, their radios crackling softly in the stillness of the house. One of them whispered that it felt like the room itself was colder than the rest of the house, though there was no open window, no draft. When the coroner arrived, he too was baffled. There were no signs of injury, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. His heart had stopped, yet there were no natural causes found on initial inspection. His body temperature was strangely lower than expected, as if he had been dead far longer than he actually had. The coroner would later admit in private that he had never seen a face frozen in such an expression of horror. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to trouble the authorities. The man's phone was found on the nightstand, but its last call had been to 911. The disturbing part was that the call had gone through, yet when dispatch replayed the recording, all that could be heard was static, followed by a faint sound that some described as heavy breathing, while others insisted it sounded like faint whispers in the background. The call had lasted exactly 47 seconds before abruptly ending. Detectives searched the house for clues, but everything seemed in order. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing valuables, no fingerprints other than his own. It was as though death had entered the house unseen and left no trace behind. Some of the younger officers began whispering among themselves about the town's old legends. There had always been rumors that the land the farmhouse sat on carried a history of strange happenings, that years earlier there were stories of people hearing voices at night or feeling watched while walking near the woods behind the property. Most dismissed those tales as folklore, yet now, standing in the dimly lit bedroom, it was harder to ignore. The autopsy brought no clarity. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but with no underlying condition to explain it. His organs were healthy, his blood work was normal, and there were no toxins detected. It was as if his body had simply decided to stop functioning, triggered by something unknown. What haunted those who saw the report was the conclusion written at the bottom. Cause of death undetermined, circumstances highly unusual. Word spread quickly through town, and the farmhouse became the subject of endless speculation. Some insisted he had been frightened to death, that perhaps he had seen something in the moments before he died. Others whispered that the property was cursed, pointing out that decades earlier, another family member had also died under mysterious circumstances in the same house, though few remembered the details. What everyone agreed on was that something about the case felt wrong, as if a piece of the truth was missing, just out of reach. Weeks turned into months, and still no answers came. The house was sealed off, left untouched after the investigation. Neighbors reported strange occurrences in the nights that followed. A woman living across the road claimed she saw a light flickering in the upstairs bedroom, even though the power had been cut. Another swore she heard knocking sounds echoing from inside the house at 3 a.m. The sheriff's office dismissed these as rumors, yet privately, some deputies admitted they avoided driving past the farmhouse after dark. The case eventually went cold, filed away as one of those unsolved mysteries that haunt small towns forever. The official records would state that the man died of cardiac arrest, but everyone who had been there that night knew there was more to the story. They remembered the expression on his face, the static-filled 911 call, the cold air that seemed to linger in the bedroom long after the body was taken away. Years later, the house still stands. The paint has peeled, the porch is collapsing, and weeds have overtaken the yard. But at night, if you pass by on the empty road and glance toward the upstairs window, some say you can still see a faint figure lying on the bed, staring upward with eyes wide open, locked forever in that same unexplainable terror. The strange death that defied all logic has never been forgotten. It remains a story told in hushed tones at diners and around campfires, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling horror is not what can be explained, but what cannot. And in that quiet Virginia town, the farmhouse continues to cast its long shadow, holding on to secrets that no one has been able to uncover. Unimaginable crimes buried in forgotten files. The courthouse basement smelled of dust and mold, a stale heaviness that seemed to cling to the walls, no matter how often the janitors sprayed disinfectant. It was a place no one wanted to linger in, with flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead and boxes stacked on metal shelves, each one labeled with fading marker, case numbers barely legible after years of neglect. Most of these files belonged to long-closed cases, matters that the system had stamped with finality. Yet, hidden among them were folders that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than simple legal disputes. Files that had been quietly pushed into the corners, cases that no one wanted to reopen, crimes so disturbing that people thought silence was safer than truth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a stormy evening in late October, a clerk searching for property records stumbled on a set of boxes marked only with a red X. They were heavier than the others, filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and brittle police reports yellowed with time. She didn't know it then, but those boxes contained accounts of events that had never been explained, horrors that had been deliberately buried. These were not cases that appeared on the news anymore, if they ever truly did. They were crimes the town had agreed to forget, yet the details inside those folders painted a different picture. The first file contained reports from a small town in the Midwest, where in the early hours of a winter morning, a farmhouse was found completely abandoned. Breakfast had been set on the table, eggs half cooked on the stove, but no one was inside. The family of 5 was simply gone. Neighbors swore they had seen the father chopping wood the night before, his breath misting in the cold air. Yet, when investigators combed through the house, they discovered something that still defies explanation. Every clock in the home had stopped at the same moment. Each watch, each wall clock, even the small wristwatch tucked in a dresser drawer, all frozen at exactly 2:17 a.m. No bodies were ever recovered, no evidence of forced entry, no tracks in the snow, just silence and the eerie stillness of a house caught in time. The file included black and white photographs of the kitchen, of the empty beds where the children should have been sleeping, of muddy footprints leading from the back door to the edge of the woods before abruptly vanishing. Officers wrote in their notes that the woods had been searched for days, dogs had been brought in, but the trail ended in nothing. The case was eventually closed with no resolution, the family listed as missing, presumed dead. But what chilled the clerk reading those reports wasn't the official conclusion. It was a single page tucked between the evidence logs, a handwritten statement from a deputy who had since retired. He wrote that during the search, he heard children's laughter echoing through the forest, even though no one was there. Another box held records from a coastal town in Maine. A fishing vessel had washed ashore without a crew. The boat was still running, lights glowing faintly in the fog, nets half pulled in, but not a single person was found on board. The captain, 2 deckhands, even the dog that usually accompanied them, gone. What was strange, investigators noted, was that all of their personal belongings remained untouched. Wallets, cigarettes, even half-eaten sandwiches were left in place as if the men had simply vanished mid-task. Blood samples were collected from the deck, smeared along the railing, though no one could determine whose blood it was. The most disturbing piece in that file was a photograph of the captain's logbook. The last entry read, "The sea is singing tonight, and we are not alone." The handwriting became erratic, ink smudged by what looked like water before the words trailed off into illegible scrawls. The Coast Guard searched for weeks, dragging the waters, but not a single body was ever recovered. Families demanded answers, officials offered theories of mutiny or drowning, but no evidence supported any explanation. Eventually, the file was marked closed, unsolved, and placed in the forgotten pile. The deeper the clerk dug into those boxes, the darker the stories became. One folder described a roadside motel in Nevada where several travelers had checked in on different nights, none of whom ever checked out. Cars were left in the parking lot, luggage neatly stacked in the rooms, but the guests themselves disappeared without a trace. Housekeepers swore they felt watched while cleaning those rooms, and some refused to enter them alone. Local deputies searched the property, pulled up carpet, even dismantled floorboards, yet they found nothing. Still, the disappearances continued until the motel abruptly shut down, its owner leaving town overnight. Rumor had it that some of the rooms were sealed off, padlocked from the outside, but when the building was eventually demolished years later, no one spoke about what might have been discovered inside. One of the most unsettling files contained a series of crime scene photographs from a small community outside New Orleans. They showed a single street where, one by one, entire households had been found dead, yet not a single wound was visible on any of the victims. Men, women, children, even pets, lifeless but without explanation. Autopsies revealed no poison, no signs of struggle, no cause of death at all. Their expressions, however, were what haunted the investigators. Each face was frozen in terror, eyes wide, mouths open, as if they had seen something so horrifying it stopped their hearts instantly. The reports ended abruptly, with no official conclusion. But at the bottom of the folder, someone had scrawled a note on the back of an evidence tag. It read, "Do not reopen. Some truths are not meant to be known." As the storm raged outside the courthouse, the clerk flipped through more files. She found witness accounts of lights in the sky above remote farmland, photographs of symbols carved into trees deep in Appalachian woods, coroner's reports from bodies found miles away from where they had disappeared, untouched by animals, preserved as if time itself had stopped around them. Every story had been silenced. Reporters were warned off, families told to stop asking questions, and communities left to quietly heal without answers. Yet reading through the notes, it was clear the investigators themselves had been shaken, writing words like unexplainable, unnatural, and beyond comprehension. The last box was the heaviest. Inside were recordings, old cassette tapes from interviews. One tape had no label, only a scratch across its plastic surface. Curious, the clerk played it in an old machine she found in the office. The recording was faint, voices distorted, but she could make out the sound of someone breathing heavily, followed by a man whispering, "It's here with us." It never left. Then came a scream, high-pitched and sudden, before the tape cut off into static. She slammed the stop button, her hands trembling. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder than before, or maybe it was just her own pulse in her ears. She wanted to leave, to run upstairs into the safety of the night watchman's presence, but part of her couldn't stop reading. She flipped through the last set of documents, which contained lists of names, all typed neatly in columns. At the bottom of each list was the same note: file closed, evidence destroyed. Except the evidence wasn't destroyed. It had been hidden down here, waiting to be found again. And as she stood in that basement, thunder rolling outside and rain lashing against the small windows, she realized something that chilled her to her core. Some of the most recent files weren't old at all. They were dated within the last decade, and the names on the missing persons lists included people she recognized, neighbors, coworkers, even a distant cousin whose disappearance had never been explained. Her breath caught as she noticed a fresh folder sitting at the top of one pile. The paper still crisp, the ink dark. On the cover was her own town's name. She hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper with a heading she had seen too many times that night. It read, "Unimaginable crimes. Status, buried." The room felt colder, the shadows seemed to stretch longer. She shut the folder, shoved it back into the box, and stumbled toward the stairwell. But as she reached for the light switch, she froze. The basement door above her was closed. She hadn't heard it shut. And from the far corner of the basement, where the shelves disappeared into darkness, came the faint sound of children laughing. She ran, heart pounding, refusing to look back, refusing to listen. The boxes remained where they had been, buried in forgotten files, their secrets intact. Yet those who had read them could never truly walk away. Because once you opened the door to those crimes, once you saw what the world had tried to erase, you understood the terrible truth. Some crimes are too dark to be solved, some horrors are never meant to see daylight, and some files are buried not because they were forgotten, but because remembering them would destroy everything we believe about safety, about justice, about reality itself. The mystery that drove detectives insane. It began on a gray October morning when the quiet town of Ashford, nestled deep in the hills of Pennsylvania, awoke to the kind of silence that feels unnatural, the kind of silence that makes you feel as though the world is holding its breath. The town was small, a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where the grocery clerk asked about your children, and where life moved at a pace that never felt rushed. But on that morning, when the air was heavy with fog and the streets glistened from a night of steady rain, the calm routine of the town was about to be torn apart. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? At exactly 7:42 a.m. A call came in to the county sheriff's office. The voice on the other end was trembling, uneven, as if struggling to form the words. A man named Harold Turner, a truck driver who had pulled over to check his tires near an abandoned farmhouse on Old Mill Road, claimed he had seen something so disturbing that his voice broke while describing it. He insisted there was a figure lying motionless in the grass beside the farmhouse and strange markings covering the walls as if someone had gone mad with red paint. Within minutes, 2 deputies were dispatched, and by 8:15 a.m., the first reports began filtering back. It was not paint. The walls of the decaying farmhouse were covered in streaks of blood, and the body lying in the tall, wet grass was not just any body. It was positioned in such a deliberate and unnatural way that it sent chills through even the most seasoned officers. Arms extended straight out, legs bent at sharp angles, and the head tilted to face the sky with eyes wide open, as though the victim had been forced into a grotesque pose before life was taken from them. The coroner was called, and as the body was examined, it was revealed that the victim had no identification, no wallet, no phone, nothing to indicate who they were. Their clothes were generic, the kind one might buy at any discount store, but there was something unusual. Sewn into the lining of the jacket was a small piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age, on which strange symbols were scrawled in dark ink. No one at the scene could decipher it. By late morning, detectives from the county's investigative unit arrived. Among them was Detective Marshall, a man with 20 years on the force, known for his calm under pressure, and Detective Reeves, younger but sharp, with a reputation for connecting dots that others overlooked. As they stepped inside the farmhouse, both men felt something shift in their stomachs. The air was thick, damp, and filled with the sour smell of rot. The wooden floors creaked as though groaning under an unseen weight, and the blood smeared across the walls seemed to form patterns rather than random splatters. Reeves muttered under his breath, pointing at the largest smear on the far wall. It was not just blood, but a circle, crudely drawn, with jagged lines cutting through it like rays. Around it were smaller markings, symbols that matched the parchment hidden in the victim's coat. No fingerprints, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this had moved with precision, leaving behind something that felt more like a message than a crime scene. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and soon the small town was drowning in rumor. Some whispered about cult activity, others about a drifter passing through, and some insisted it was something darker, something that could not be explained by rational means. The local newspaper printed a front-page story calling it "The Ritual on Old Mill Road," and overnight, fear rooted itself in the town's heart. The investigation deepened. The victim's fingerprints were run through every available database, but there was no match. Dental records revealed nothing. It was as though the person had never officially existed. And then, just as detectives were grappling with this void of information, another discovery was made. Exactly 1 week after the farmhouse incident, at the same time in the morning, another body appeared. This time on the steps of the old courthouse downtown, a place long abandoned and condemned, its windows shattered and its halls crawling with vines. Once again, the body was arranged in a twisted pose with a parchment hidden in the clothing. The symbols matched. The blood painted across the courthouse doors formed another strange pattern, different from the first, but equally deliberate. Detectives Marshall and Reeves felt the weight of something that was no longer a simple crime. These were not random murders, not crimes of passion or opportunity. Someone was leaving behind a trail, constructing something larger than any of them could comprehend. The two men pored over the parchments late into the night, spreading them across the desk under dim fluorescent lights. They called in experts from nearby universities, linguists, historians, even cryptographers. Each one studied the markings, and each one came back with the same unsettling response. The symbols did not belong to any known language, any known culture. They seemed invented, yet carried a strange logic of their own, as though designed to communicate something beyond human understanding. As the weeks passed, the murders continued. Every 7 days, like clockwork, another body appeared in another forgotten place around the county. An abandoned church, a railway tunnel, a shuttered motel on the edge of town. Always the same patterns, always the same symbols, always the same absence of identity in the victims, and always the same growing sense of dread among the investigators. Detective Marshall, who had once prided himself on rationality, began to lose sleep. He confessed to Reeves that he heard whispers at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, repeating words he could not understand. Reeves, though skeptical, admitted that he too felt a constant pressure, a sense of being watched when alone. Their colleagues noticed their decline. What had begun as a case had become an obsession, one that clawed at their sanity with every passing day. The media attention swelled, with reporters descending on Ashford, painting it as a town cursed, a place gripped by an unseen terror. Residents began locking their doors before sundown, avoiding the streets after dark. Churches filled with people desperate for comfort, while others fled the town entirely. Businesses closed, leaving storefronts empty. The once quiet community had been hollowed out, consumed by fear. Then came the night that finally broke the detectives. It was bitterly cold, with frost coating the ground like glass. A call came in at 3:17 a.m., reporting movement at the abandoned railway tunnel where one of the bodies had been found. Marshall and Reeves rushed to the scene, flashlights cutting through the icy darkness. As they stepped inside the tunnel, their beams illuminated something that stopped them cold. The walls were no longer streaked with old graffiti, but covered in fresh blood, thick and wet, spelling out words they could almost read. As they moved deeper, the symbols began to shift, curving into forms that resembled letters, as though the unknown language had begun merging with English. And at the far end of the tunnel, sitting upright against the wall, was a figure they recognized. It was Harold Turner, the truck driver who had first called in the farmhouse discovery. His eyes were open, his expression frozen in terror, his hands clutching another parchment. On it, scrawled in shaky handwriting that was unmistakably human this time, were the words, "They are coming and you cannot stop them." The sound that followed was one Marshall would never forget. A low hum vibrating through the steel of the tunnel, so deep it rattled their bones. Reeves dropped his flashlight, and in that moment of darkness, something moved. Not footsteps, not the shifting of a person, but a ripple, as though the air itself was alive. When they scrambled back toward the entrance, both men swore they saw shadows that did not belong to them, stretching unnaturally along the walls, reaching out like hands. In the weeks that followed, the case unraveled. Reports were filed, but the words within them made no sense. Evidence vanished from storage, parchments crumbled to dust as though they had never existed. The higher authorities dismissed it all as hysteria, A town caught in the grip of collective fear, detectives who had worked themselves to exhaustion and lost their grip on reality. Marshall resigned not long after, retreating to a cabin in the woods where no one could reach him. Reeves disappeared entirely, his apartment left unlocked, his belongings untouched, as though he had simply walked out and never returned. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind no answers, only scars. To this day, the story of Ashford is whispered about in Pennsylvania, the tale of a mystery so profound it drove the best detectives to madness. Some claim it was a cult, others that it was something far older, something that had slipped into our world for reasons no one could explain. But those who were closest to it know one thing. It was not a case that could be solved. It was a message and perhaps a warning. And sometimes, late at night, in the silence of those empty streets, locals say you can still hear it. That low hum, faint but unmistakable, rolling through the hills like a promise. A sound that reminds them the mystery was never truly over. It was only waiting. Unsolved crimes hidden in plain sight.t. The night was colder than usual when the first reports came in. In a small town surrounded by miles of farmland and quiet back roads, the local police received a call just after midnight. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, almost frantic. A man had been seen standing under a flickering streetlight on Ashwood Lane, not moving, not speaking, just staring. The caller thought he was drunk at first, but then realized something was deeply wrong. The figure wasn't swaying or shivering in the chill. He was perfectly still, like a statue, his face lost in the shadows. When officers finally arrived, minutes later, the man was gone, leaving only a pair of muddy footprints pressed into the damp pavement. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? At the time, it didn't seem like much, just another strange incident in a town that rarely made headlines. But within weeks, more calls followed. A woman driving home late saw a figure crouched near the old railway bridge, holding what looked like a torn piece of clothing. When she slowed down to look closer, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing almost instantly. She swore she had seen blood on his hands. Others began reporting bizarre encounters, fleeting glimpses of someone standing in places no one should be at those hours. Near the school playground at night, in the overgrown cemetery by the church, in the windows of houses that had been abandoned for years, always watching, always silent. The unease spread quietly through town. People avoided walking after dark, doors were locked earlier than usual, and whispers carried in hushed tones about someone out there who didn't belong. Yet no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. One morning, a local farmer named Thomas failed to return from his routine before dawn chores. His wife went looking for him near the barn and found the doors ajar, a lantern still burning faintly inside. But Thomas was nowhere. His boots were left in the dirt as if he had stepped out of them. His coat hung neatly on a nail, untouched. Search parties combed the fields, calling his name until sunrise painted the horizon, but there was no sign of him. Days later, the sheriff's department received a brown envelope slipped under their office door. Inside was a photograph, grainy and dark. It showed Thomas standing under that same streetlight on Ashwood Lane, staring into the camera with lifeless eyes. Behind him, barely visible, was a figure in the shadows, taller than him, with its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The envelope had no return address, no fingerprints, nothing. That photograph marked the beginning of what locals would later call the season of fear. Not long after Thomas vanished, a young couple driving home from a late-night movie reported seeing someone lying on the side of Miller Road. They pulled over, thinking it was a person in need of help, but as soon as they stepped out, the figure bolted into the woods. The man gave chase for a few steps before stopping. Because the fleeing figure didn't run like a person, it moved in jerks and lurches, arms hanging at strange angles, its head snapping from side to side as if it were searching in the dark. The couple drove straight to the sheriff's office, their voices trembling as they tried to explain what they saw. Then came the second disappearance. A school teacher named Linda failed to show up for class one morning. When officers checked her home, they found the front door unlocked and her car still parked in the driveway. Inside, everything seemed in place, except for a trail of wet footprints leading from the back door to the kitchen table. On the table lay another photograph, this time showing Linda sitting inside her car with someone standing behind her, their face obscured by a hood, one hand resting on her shoulder. The photo looked recent, taken perhaps the night before. But Linda was gone, and she would never be seen again. By then, fear had reached a boiling point. Parents refused to let their children play outside. Night patrols doubled, yet they caught nothing. People swore they saw someone lurking, yet whenever police responded, there was no trace left behind. More photographs began arriving. Each one slipped quietly under the sheriff's office door, each one showing the missing person in an eerie pose, always with that shadowy figure lurking close by. No one could figure out who was taking the photos or how they were being delivered without anyone seeing. The strangest part was how public it all seemed. These crimes were not hidden in distant woods or secret basements. They were unfolding right in the heart of the community, in plain sight, yet no one could stop them. Weeks stretched into months. Fear became a way of life. People began boarding up their windows, selling their homes, leaving town altogether. The main street grew quieter, businesses closed earlier, and whispers about curses and old legends spread like wildfire. Some claimed the town was built over unmarked graves. Others swore it was the work of a cult operating in the open, using fear to control everyone. But no explanation ever satisfied the dread that lingered. One late evening, just before winter, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night near the abandoned church at the edge of town, a place where several sightings had been reported. They brought flashlights and snacks, laughing nervously as they tried to act brave. But by midnight, laughter had turned to silence. They noticed movement inside the church through the broken stained glass windows, a figure pacing slowly up and down the aisle. When one of them shone a flashlight toward the doorway, the beam caught something horrifying. Dozens of photographs, just like the ones the sheriff had received, were taped along the inside walls of the church. Faces of the missing stared back at them, each photo showing the same shadowy figure lingering close behind. The teens fled in terror, but not all of them made it home. By morning, one of them was missing, leaving only his flashlight at the church's entrance, still glowing weakly against the cold stone steps. Another envelope appeared at the sheriff's office the following day. Inside was a photo of the boy standing in the church doorway. Behind him, the same towering shadow, head tilted to the side, staring into the camera. The sheriff, exhausted and overwhelmed, admitted he could no longer protect the town. Investigators from the outside came in, studied the photographs, interviewed witnesses, searched every corner. Yet nothing ever tied together. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no fibers or DNA. The figure that everyone saw always remained just out of reach, always disappearing the moment you tried to focus on it. In time, the disappearances slowed, but the fear never left. The town became hollow, many families abandoning their homes. The church was sealed, the roads grew empty, and even now, those who live nearby refuse to speak of what happened. They say if you drive down Ashwood Lane late at night, you might see someone standing perfectly still under the streetlight, staring without blinking, waiting. And if you stop to look too long, you might find an envelope on your doorstep the very next morning holding a photograph of yourself with that same figure standing right behind you. To this day, the crimes remain unsolved, the photographs remain locked away in evidence files, and the figure that haunted the town has never been identified. It all happened in plain sight in front of neighbors, friends, and family, yet no one was able to stop it. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part, that the truth was never hiding. It was standing right there, watching as people vanished one by one into the darkness. Cases too disturbing for the headlines. On a cold evening in late autumn, when the air carried that sharp bite that seemed to creep straight into the bones. A small town in Pennsylvania found itself at the center of a nightmare that would never be printed in its local paper. The town was quiet. Rows of dimly lit houses along narrow streets, the kind of place where people locked their doors but still trusted their neighbors enough to wave goodnight. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there until one night when something so disturbing unfolded that even the most hardened investigators struggled to put it into words. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It began just after 9 when a call came into the county sheriff's office. A neighbor reported hearing screams coming from a farmhouse that stood on the edge of town. The farmhouse was old, weathered wood splintering beneath layers of paint that had long since given up fighting the years. For decades, it had been home to a family that mostly kept to themselves. The caller's voice shook as he described the sound, high-pitched, ragged, not the kind of cry you'd expect from someone startled or angry. It was the kind of scream that made the hair on your arms stand straight, the kind that hinted at something primal, something wrong. 2 deputies arrived on scene within minutes. The yard was silent, the gravel driveway scattered with wet leaves, the porch light flickered, swaying slightly in the wind. They approached cautiously, knocking on the door, announcing themselves. No answer. What they found when they stepped inside would haunt them for years to come. The living room smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Furniture was overturned, photographs shattered on the floor, glass crunching under their boots. The deputies moved slowly, flashlights cutting through the shadows. In the kitchen, the table was set for dinner, plates still warm, food untouched. Chairs lay scattered as though people had been startled in the middle of a meal, and then in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, they saw it. Dark streaks along the wall, smeared handprints dragged downward, as though someone had clawed desperately at the surface trying to hold on. The prints led toward a closed door at the far end. With weapons drawn, they pushed forward, calling out again. No response. When the door swung open, the beam of light revealed a scene that froze them in place. 3 family members were there, lifeless, positioned in a way that was almost deliberate, as if staged. Eyes wide, mouths slightly open, their bodies placed side by side on the floor. Each one had marks around the wrists, as though bound at some point, but the restraints were gone. And the most chilling part, each had the same expression of terror carved across their face, as though whatever they had seen in their final moments was far worse than the violence itself. The 4th member of the household, the youngest, was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the fields behind the farmhouse, flashlights bobbing in the night, calling out her name. Hours passed with no trace. The woods felt oppressive, the air unnaturally still, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath heavy boots. When dawn broke, investigators found a trail leading deeper into the trees, small footprints pressed into the damp earth, ending abruptly at a creek that wound its way through the forest. There, half buried in mud, was a single shoe. The child was never seen again. News outlets picked up whispers of the case, but details were scarce. The sheriff's office refused to release photographs, citing their disturbing nature. Local reporters who pressed too hard were warned off, told that some things were better left unsaid. The official story spoke only of a tragic incident. No specifics, no follow-up. To this day, the files remain sealed, stored in a cabinet deep within the county courthouse basement, marked with a single word across the folder: withheld. But that was only one case. Years later, hundreds of miles away, in a small town in Kentucky, another story unfolded that shared the same unnerving silence in its aftermath. It was late summer when a young couple driving home along a rural highway spotted something unusual. Just past midnight, headlights caught the figure of a man standing in the middle of the road. He didn't move, didn't flinch at the blaring horn. The couple swerved, heart pounding, pulling to the shoulder. When they looked back, the man was gone. Shaken, they continued on, only to find a pickup truck parked half a mile ahead, engine still running, driver's door wide open. The radio played softly inside. static breaking through faint country music. A wallet sat on the dashboard, filled with cash and identification. But the driver was nowhere in sight. Deputies searched the area until sunrise. In the nearby field, they found strange patterns carved into the grass, wide circles pressed flat, as if something massive had landed there. The missing man's footprints were scattered, moving in frantic directions before cutting off completely at the edge of one of the circles. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where he went. The case was quietly filed as a missing person. But investigators who had seen the scene spoke privately of something they couldn't explain. The story never reached the papers. There are dozens more hidden away in forgotten archives. In a small Illinois town, a family disappeared overnight, their house left perfectly intact, dinner dishes still in the sink, laundry folded neatly on the couch, even the family dog locked inside the bedroom, barking frantically when police entered. Every trace of the family was gone. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just silence. Weeks of searching turned up nothing. Eventually, the house was sold, repainted, and passed to a new family. But neighbors whispered about lights flickering in the windows late at night, shadows moving when the house should have been empty. None of those reports were ever taken seriously. The official story vanished into silence. And in Oregon, a group of hikers stumbled across something they would never forget. Deep in the woods, miles from any trail, they found a clearing filled with dozens of animal bones arranged in intricate patterns. At the center, a large wooden cross stood upright, draped in torn pieces of clothing. Tucked into the branches above, a weathered photograph of a child smiled down, pinned with rusted nails. Authorities who investigated labeled it a disturbed individual's work, dismissed it as unsettling but not criminal. Yet those who saw it firsthand swore that the bones weren't all animal. Some, they insisted, looked far too human. These are cases too disturbing for the headlines, stories that never made it to the evening news, hidden behind closed doors and sealed files. They are spoken about in hushed tones by investigators long since retired, men and women who wake in the night with memories of things they cannot forget. The public will never know the full details. Perhaps it is mercy, perhaps it is fear. Because sometimes what really happens in the shadows of small towns and quiet highways is far worse than any headline could ever capture. And sometimes the silence that follows is the loudest sound of all. Terrifying cases that made no senses. It was a late autumn evening in the small town of Millwood, Ohio, when the first case shook the quiet community. The air was crisp, leaves scattered across empty streets, and the town had already begun preparing for the long winter ahead. At around 9 o'clock that night, residents along Cedar Avenue reported a series of strange sounds echoing through the neighborhood. Some said it was a scream, others insisted it was more like a distorted cry, almost mechanical in tone. What made it even more unsettling was that when police arrived, within minutes, there was no one outside, no signs of struggle, and no reason at all for the chilling noise that dozens had claimed to hear. The officers did their rounds, knocking on doors, asking questions, but no explanation surfaced. It was written off as pranksters, but no one ever came forward, and nothing like it happened again. The silence that followed only deepened the mystery, leaving a scar in the memory of everyone who heard it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? A few weeks later, just before sunrise, an even stranger case occurred. A truck driver passing through Interstate 71 near Columbus pulled over at a rest stop to grab some coffee and stretch his legs. He noticed a small sedan parked at the farthest corner of the lot, engine still running, headlights dim in the fog. At first, he thought someone was sleeping inside, but as he approached, he realized the driver's door was wide open and the car was completely empty. The keys dangled in the ignition, a purse was on the passenger seat, and the dashboard showed that the vehicle had barely been driven in the last few hours. State troopers were called, and they carefully combed the area, but there were no footprints leading away from the car, no evidence of foul play, and no sign of the owner anywhere. It was as though the driver had simply vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, missing posters went up, and news outlets speculated endlessly, but no trace of the person was ever found. The case became known among locals as the car that drove itself, an unsolved event that to this day haunts truckers who pass that lonely rest stop before dawn. Then came the winter storm in Michigan, where an isolated farmhouse near Traverse City became the center of another unsolvable case. On a January night, as snow piled high and winds howled through the trees, neighbors noticed that the lights in the farmhouse flickered wildly before going completely dark. A family of 4 lived there, known in the community for keeping to themselves. When police arrived after a concerned neighbor called the station, they found the front door partially open, snow drifting inside the entryway. The strange part was that the house showed no signs of disturbance. Dinner was set neatly on the table, the fire in the fireplace had been left burning, and children's toys lay scattered across the living room rug. But the family was gone. Search teams trudged through the snow-covered fields, dogs sniffed for trails, helicopters scanned the area, but nothing emerged. Not a single footprint in the snow suggested that anyone had even left the house. The storm had been heavy, but investigators concluded the snow hadn't yet fallen thick enough to erase human tracks. It was as though the family had simply evaporated into the cold air, leaving behind warmth, food, and silence. Months later, in New Mexico, another case emerged that baffled authorities. In a small desert town outside Albuquerque, a man was found standing motionless in the middle of a dirt road just after midnight. A passing motorist stopped, rolled down the window, and asked if he was all right. The man didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, as though frozen in place. When deputies arrived, they discovered the man was alive but completely unresponsive, locked in some kind of waking paralysis. He was rushed to a hospital, and though doctors confirmed he was physically healthy, he never regained the ability to speak. He only stared blankly ahead, unblinking for long stretches, murmuring incoherent words that no one could decipher. Authorities identified him through fingerprints, but when they reached his relatives across state lines, they learned he had been reported missing 3 months earlier, hundreds of miles away. Where he had been during that time and what had reduced him to a shell of his former self remains an unsolved question. He lived in a care facility for years afterward, never speaking a clear word again. In the southern state of Georgia, another bizarre case unfolded one humid summer night. A group of teenagers exploring an abandoned textile mill stumbled upon something that none of them would ever forget. Deep inside the decaying structure, among rusted machinery and shattered glass, they found dozens of chairs arranged in a perfect circle. On each chair sat a faded Polaroid photograph, all depicting different strangers, men and women of various ages, sitting at what looked like kitchen tables, staring directly into the camera. None of the photos had dates or names, and none of the faces were recognized by the teens. They reported their discovery, and soon local police secured the mill for investigation. But when authorities returned the next morning, the circle of chairs was gone, the photos had vanished, and the only thing left was an empty room with dust undisturbed. For weeks, rumors spread about secret cults, about rituals held in forgotten factories, about people being watched without their knowledge. Yet no answers ever surfaced, and the photographs were never seen again. Perhaps the most unsettling case was reported in the coastal town of Bar Harbor, Maine. On a foggy evening, fishermen preparing to head out for an overnight trip noticed a faint light flickering offshore. At first, they thought it was another vessel, but when they looked through binoculars, they saw what looked like an old wooden rowboat drifting aimlessly. Inside the boat sat a single chair, and on the chair rested a radio transmitter that clicked with static. The fishermen hauled the boat back to shore, and authorities quickly arrived. The strange part was that the radio wasn't connected to any power source, yet it continued to hum with bursts of static as though alive. Technicians examined it, dismantled it, tested it, but they couldn't explain how it had been transmitting at all. Even stranger, the boat itself had no registration, no markings, and seemed far older than any vessel expected to be found floating in that area. Some believed it was a leftover relic from decades past. Others swore it was a message, a signal left intentionally. But the mystery of where the boat had come from and why that transmitter had been placed so deliberately inside was never solved. Each of these cases carried with it a silence that lingered in the towns and cities where they occurred. People whispered about them at diners, shared theories in hushed tones in bars, and warned each other to stay cautious during late-night drives. What tied them all together was the utter absence of logic, the void of explanation that made investigators feel as though they were chasing shadows. They wrote reports, filed documents, archived evidence, yet every piece only led to more questions. For some, it was a reminder that the world holds secrets too dark and strange to ever be understood. For others, it was a chilling warning that sometimes people, families, and entire lives can disappear without reason, leaving behind only fragments of stories that will never be whole again. And so the cases sit, buried in old police files and whispered in local legends. A scream that came from nowhere in a quiet Ohio town. A car abandoned on the side of a highway with its driver missing forever. A family that vanished from their dinner table in the middle of a snowstorm. A man reduced to a living statue returned from nowhere. A circle of photographs in an abandoned mill that disappeared overnight. A ghostly boat with a radio that should not have been able to speak. All of them terrifying, all of them unsolved, and all of them haunting reminders that some truths will never be revealed. The creepy legend that turned out to be real. There are places in America that carry a darkness with them, a weight that people feel the moment they step foot near them. Towns where locals whisper warnings, where stories are told to scare children into obedience, yet deep down, those same children know the stories were not just to frighten them, they were to protect them. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On the edge of a quiet town in Pennsylvania stood an abandoned farmhouse that no one dared approach after sunset. The house sat along a narrow dirt road, hidden behind rows of tall skeletal trees that looked almost like they were trying to conceal it. The wooden boards were weathered and gray, with the roof sagging inward and broken shutters hanging by rusted hinges. To anyone passing by, it was just another decaying building in the countryside, but for the people who lived nearby, it was known as the house that should never be entered. The legend had been whispered for decades. People spoke of screams that carried through the woods at night, of lantern lights flickering in the upper windows, even though the place had no electricity. Travelers claimed to see a figure standing motionless at the end of the road, a silhouette with no face, before it suddenly vanished. The story went further, darker, telling of a family who once lived there, a family that had mysteriously vanished one cold November night. No one could ever explain what happened, but when authorities entered the farmhouse, they said the dinner table was set as if the family had been about to eat. The food was untouched, and the chairs were neatly tucked in. It was as though the people had simply stood up, walked out into the woods, and never returned. For years, nobody dared to touch the property. Nature reclaimed the land, vines crept up the siding, and the windows were clouded with grime. But the legend lived on. High school students dared each other to walk up the road on Halloween, and some swore they heard footsteps following them even when no one was behind them. Others spoke of whispers drifting through the night air, soft and urgent, urging them to turn back before it was too late. It was late October when three friends from town decided they were going to prove the stories were nothing more than exaggerated tales. The evening had turned colder than expected, and the wind carried with it the smell of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. The group parked their car along the edge of the old road and began walking toward the house with only their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, unnervingly quiet, as if the entire forest was listening. When the farmhouse came into view, one of them muttered that it felt wrong to be there. The others laughed nervously, insisting it was just an old house, nothing more. But as they drew closer, the temperature dropped sharply and their breath came out in white clouds. They noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, creaking gently with each gust of wind. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and rot. Their footsteps echoed on the warped floorboards as dust swirled in the beam of their flashlights. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and in the kitchen, the old dining table still stood, covered in a thick layer of dust. Plates and silverware were still neatly arranged, as if waiting for a meal that never came. One of the friends reached out and touched the back of a chair, only to pull his hand back quickly. The wood felt strangely warm, as though someone had just been sitting there. They laughed nervously again, trying to convince themselves it was just their imagination, but unease had already set in. In the silence, they thought they heard something upstairs. A slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep on the old boards above them. They froze, holding their breath, staring at one another with wide eyes. One whispered that it was probably just the house settling, but deep down, none of them believed that. Against their better judgment, they climbed the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, and each movement felt like it echoed far too loudly. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors that hung crooked on their frames. They pushed one open and found a bedroom. The bed still made, though the sheets were yellowed with age. A child's toy sat on the dresser, its once bright paint faded, and as one of them shined a light on it, the toy suddenly tipped over on its own. The sound of it hitting the wood made all of them jump back in fear. Another creak echoed from the far end of the hallway, and this time, it was unmistakable. Someone was walking. Slow, heavy steps, drawing closer. The air grew colder with every second. So cold, their fingers ached as they gripped their flashlights tighter. One of them whispered they should leave, but when they turned to head back, the staircase was no longer visible. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretched into darkness that hadn't been there moments earlier. Panic set in. They began moving quickly, trying door after door, but each room looked the same. A bed, a dresser, peeling wallpaper. It was as if the house was rearranging itself around them, refusing to let them out. Then came the sound that made their blood run cold. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but a soft whisper, calling their names. The voice was distorted, almost gurgling like it came from underwater. And it wasn't just one voice, but several, overlapping, whispering in unison. Their flashlights flickered, plunging them into brief pockets of darkness. In those moments, they swore they saw shadows moving across the walls, figures just out of reach, taller than any human should be. One of them screamed, pointing at the end of the hall. Standing there was a figure, tall and thin, its face nothing more than a pale blur. It tilted its head unnaturally far to the side, and the whispers grew louder, rushing into their ears until they could barely think. They ran, bursting into room after room, trying desperately to find the staircase again, but the layout made no sense. Doors led to dead ends, and windows that should have opened to the outside revealed only more darkness, like an endless void pressing against the glass. Then, without warning, they found themselves back in the kitchen. The table stood there, just as before, but this time the plates were no longer empty. Each one was filled with rotting, mold-covered food. The chairs were pulled out, as though someone had just been sitting there waiting for them to arrive. One of the friends collapsed in terror, sobbing uncontrollably, while the others pulled at the front door. At first, it wouldn't budge, as if the house itself was holding it shut. Then, with a violent crack, it burst open, and they stumbled out into the freezing night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, hearts pounding, lungs burning, unable to shake the feeling that something was still following them. When they finally made it back to town, they were pale and trembling, barely able to explain what had happened. They swore they would never return, and in the days that followed, each of them suffered strange disturbances. Footsteps in their homes at night, whispers in their ears when no one was there, and dreams of the faceless figure watching them from the shadow. Years later, people still avoid the farmhouse. The story of those three friends only added to the legend, fueling the warnings that locals passed down. Some say the house is a trap, built not to shelter a family, but to lure the living inside and keep them there forever. Others claim the family that vanished never truly left, that their restless spirits still wander the halls, whispering for company in the endless dark. What makes the legend truly terrifying is that it has never faded. New reports surface every so often. A hiker who got too close to the road swore he saw a lantern light flickering in the upstairs window. A driver passing by late at night claimed a figure stepped into the road and then disappeared into thin air. Some say if you stand outside the farmhouse at midnight, you can hear the sound of chairs scraping across the wooden floor, and if you don't leave immediately, you'll never walk out again. The farmhouse still stands, decaying but undefeated, as if time itself refuses to touch it. And the legend remains alive, not just a tale to scare children, but a reminder that some places carry with them a darkness that cannot be explained, a darkness that does not let go. The creepy legend turned out to be real, and anyone who doubts it only needs to step onto that lonely dirt road at night. If they listen closely, they'll hear the whispers waiting for them, calling them by name, ready to welcome them into the house that never lets go. What they found in the abandoned car. It was a late afternoon in the middle of October when the wind carried that uneasy chill that always seems to come before nightfall. The highway was unusually quiet, with only the occasional truck roaring past and leaving behind the echo of its engine. Just off a stretch of road in rural Ohio, a highway patrol officer noticed something that didn't belong. Parked at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by weeds and brush, was an old beat-up sedan. Its driver's side door was closed, but the angle of the car seemed wrong, as if it had rolled and come to a stop instead of being deliberately parked. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? At first glance, it looked like just another abandoned vehicle. That stretch of highway had seen plenty of them cars left behind after accidents, stolen vehicles dumped and forgotten, or simply broken down machines waiting for a tow. But there was something unsettling about this one. The officer pulled his cruiser over and walked toward the car, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The sun was sinking low, and long shadows stretched across the asphalt, bleeding into the dark outline of the woods. The sedan's paint was peeling, its windows streaked with grime. He immediately noticed that the license plates had been removed. That alone was strange enough, but as he leaned closer, he realized the windshield had a faint spiderweb crack running from one corner, like it had been struck hard. Dust covered the hood, but there were smudges on the driver's side window, smudges that looked too much like handprints. The officer tugged on the driver's side handle. It was unlocked. The smell that rushed out made him recoil. A pungent, metallic odor hung in the air, mixed with something sweet and rotten. Inside, the upholstery was torn and stained, but that wasn't what froze him in place. On the passenger seat sat a small leather-bound notebook, its edges curled from moisture. On the floor beneath the steering wheel was a single shoe, scuffed and mud-caked, and in the back seat, pressed against the door, was a dark, crusted stain that could only be blood. He called it in immediately, requesting backup. Within the hour, state police and investigators arrived, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. They taped off the area and began their work, pulling on gloves, photographing every detail, carefully dusting for prints. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the situation became. There was no wallet, no ID, nothing that could identify who had driven the car. The glove compartment had been emptied except for a broken pen and a crumpled fast food receipt. But the date on that receipt was weeks old. The odometer showed the car hadn't been driven far since then. The trunk was the real horror. When officers forced it open, their flashlights revealed a large black trash bag stuffed against the far corner. It was tied with electrical cord, the plastic stretched and torn in places. When they cut it open, the stench was unbearable. Inside was clothing, women's clothing, damp and stained, a jacket, a torn blouse, and jeans with the knees ripped open. Folded between the fabric was something else, a set of photographs. Each picture was of a different location. Abandoned farmhouses, empty playgrounds, remote dirt roads swallowed by trees. In every photo, there was a date scrawled on the back. The notebook from the front seat offered more clues, but also more terror. Its pages were filled with shaky handwriting, short entries that read like fragments of thought. Some described watching people from afar. She walked alone again. Same route, same time. Others were even darker. The woods hide everything. They don't hear the screaming in there. And one line in particular made the investigators pause. The car is only the beginning. Neighbors from the area were questioned. A farmer down the road mentioned he had seen the car parked there a few nights before, but he hadn't paid much attention. Another person recalled hearing strange noises near the woods late at night, something between a scream and a shout, cut off suddenly. For weeks, the police scoured the forest that bordered the highway. They found disturbed soil in several places, shallow pits half covered with leaves, but nothing inside them. It was as if whoever had used that car had moved quickly, changing spots, hiding something they didn't want discovered. The photographs were traced, and investigators visited each location. At two of them, they found more evidence, shreds of fabric, small bone fragments, and at one site, a rusted shovel leaning against a collapsed shed. Despite all this, no one ever came forward to claim the car. No missing person report matched the clothing found in the trunk. The shoe from the driver's side was never paired with an owner. The notebook, with its disturbing messages, offered no name, no signature, just page after page of unsettling thoughts that felt less like a journal and more like a record of stalking. The car was eventually towed to a secured lot, but even there, officers who had to process it described feeling uneasy. Some swore the smell of decay lingered no matter how much evidence had been removed. Others said the notebook pages seemed to shift, like words were darker each time they looked, though that was likely exhaustion playing trick. What makes the case so disturbing is not only what was found inside the abandoned car, but what was never explained. Who wrote in that notebook? Whose clothing was hidden in the trash bag? Why those specific locations photographed and dated? To this day, locals driving past that stretch of highway say they feel a chill when they see the turnout where the sedan was discovered. Some claim that on foggy nights, headlights catch a shadow moving near the trees, as if someone is still standing there watching. Others say it's just the imagination running wild after hearing the story. But one fact remains. The car appeared without warning, filled with evidence of something unspeakable, and then vanished into storage. No owner, no missing person tied to it, no answers. Only questions that continue to haunt anyone who has read the case file. And the notebook's final entry still echoes like a threat, written in uneven letters at the bottom of the last page. They won't find the rest. The terrifying discovery beneath the houses. On a quiet stretch of land just outside of Ashford, a small town in the American Midwest, there stood an old farmhouse that locals avoided after dark. The property had been empty for decades, its wooden frame weathered by endless winters and long, humid summers. The paint had peeled away to gray splinters, the shutters hung loose, and the porch sagged under its own weight. Children riding their bikes past the dirt road whispered that the house breathed at night, that if you stopped long enough, you could hear faint scratching coming from under the floor. Adults, of course, dismissed it as folklore, but no one really lingered there, not even the brave ones. The land was purchased by a middle-aged couple who had recently moved from the city. They wanted space, peace, and maybe even the kind of charm that came with an old house, the sort of place that could be restored and lived in proudly. The property was large, surrounded by acres of tall grass that bent like waves when the wind picked up. At dusk, deer wandered out of the woods at the far edge of the land, their silhouettes quiet and watchful against the horizon. The couple arrived one chilly evening in late autumn, boxes stacked in the back of a pickup truck. The air smelled of damp earth, and the house loomed before them like something frozen in time. The first night inside, with lanterns instead of steady electricity, was unsettling. The boards creaked under every step, dust floated in the beams of their flashlights, and the wind rattled the loose shingles on the roof. They chalked it up to the character of an old place, the sort of thing they had signed up for. But beneath the surface of that house was something they had not signed up for. Something that would unravel their peace and turn the property into a nightmare. It began on the second week during renovations. Early one morning, just as the sun was climbing above the tree line, the husband pried open a section of rotted floorboards near the back room. He was planning to reinforce the support beams underneath. As he pulled the boards away, a wave of damp, earthy air hit him different from the ordinary smell of mold or dust. This was heavier, rancid, almost metallic. He leaned closer with a flashlight, expecting to see soil or maybe a nest of animals. Instead, the beam caught what looked like the edge of stone. Not natural stone, but carved, straight lines, deliberate. He called for his wife, and together they peered into the opening. The gap was narrow, but it revealed a dark space beneath the house, deeper than a crawl space. The stone appeared to be part of a wall, a structure hidden underground. Curiosity outweighed fear, and by late afternoon, they had widened the hole enough to descend with a ladder. The air grew colder as they went down, their breaths visible in the light. The small chamber beneath the house was made of old brick, its ceiling low enough to force them to crouch. It didn't feel like a basement, more like a hidden cellar. The bricks were stained dark, and faint markings were etched along the walls. Some looked like crude symbols, others like scratch marks made by desperate hands. In the far corner of the chamber sat a wooden chest, its lid swollen with age. The husband hesitated, but the wife urged him to open it. When the lid groaned upward, the smell of decay flooded the room. Inside were bundles of fabric, blackened and brittle with age. At first, they thought it was clothing, until the wife noticed what was wrapped inside the folds. Small bones, stacked carefully, arranged as if someone had placed them with intention. They recoiled in shock. These were not animal remains, they were unmistakably human. The couple scrambled back to the ladder, their flashlights shaking in their hands, the air pressing heavy on their chests. Once outside, they sat on the porch in silence, staring at the tree line as the sky dimmed into twilight. Neither wanted to be the first to admit what they had found. That night, the scratching began. At first, it was faint, like mice scuttling behind the walls. But as the hours dragged on, the sound grew sharper, more deliberate. Long drags across the wood, as though someone with broken nails was clawing upward from beneath the floor. Sleep was impossible. The wife swore she heard muffled cries beneath the house, not loud enough to be words, but rhythmic, pleading. The husband dismissed it as imagination, though his own hands trembled as he lit another lantern. Around 3 a.m, every lantern in the house flickered at once, and the scratching stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. The following morning, the couple decided to contact the county sheriff. When deputies arrived, they descended into the cellar with masks and stronger lights. Hours passed, and when they resurfaced, their faces were pale. They confirmed the bones were human. Multiple sets. Children and adults alike. The chamber beneath the house was larger than it first appeared, extending into narrow tunnels. One of the deputies muttered that the structure looked older than the house itself, possibly older than the town. Word spread quickly, and soon the house drew attention from locals, journalists, and even historians. Old records revealed whispers of disappearances in Ashford, families that had vanished without explanation, farmhands who walked off shifts and never came back. Rumors told of rituals, of a group that had once gathered in hidden chambers, lured by promises of power or protection. Nothing had ever been proven, but the cellar beneath the farmhouse seemed to confirm the worst fears. The couple was told they could leave, that the property would be sealed off during the investigation, but something in them resisted. The wife claimed she felt watched whenever she tried to pack. The husband confessed he couldn't shake the feeling that if they left, whatever was beneath the house would follow. At night, the scratching returned. Sometimes it was beneath the floorboards, other times it echoed in the walls or from the attic above. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the wife heard a soft knocking from beneath the floor. Not frantic, not scratching, just 3 slow knocks, repeating. She froze, her skin crawling. When she whispered her husband's name, the knocks stopped. He rushed into the room, only to find fresh cracks spreading across the floorboards where the sound had come from. The sheriff's office continued to explore the tunnels, but progress was slow. Some passages collapsed without warning, others led into dead ends marked with strange carvings. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, until their lights barely penetrated the darkness. At one point, a deputy reported hearing footsteps behind him, though the others swore no one was there. Another deputy refused to return after claiming he heard a voice whisper his name. The couple's final night in the house came without warning. Around midnight, a storm rolled in, thunder shaking the old frame of the farmhouse. Rain hammered the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks. In the chaos, the wife screamed. Her husband rushed to her, only to see her standing in the living room pointing at the floor. The boards had begun to bow upward, as if something beneath them was pressing against the wood. The scratching was deafening now, joined by muffled cries, dozens of voices rising in agony. The boards split, dust and splinters flying, and through the cracks came the sight of pale, skeletal fingers reaching upward. The husband grabbed his wife, dragging her toward the door as the floor gave way behind them. Lanterns toppled, glass shattered, and the house filled with the stench of rot and earth. They ran into the storm, the rain soaking their clothes, their hearts pounding as they turned back to see the farmhouse shaking as though alive. Windows burst outward, the roof groaned, and the sound of those voices carried into the night, a wailing chorus of despair and rage. By dawn, when the storm had passed, the farmhouse stood silent. The couple never returned. Officials who came later found the house intact, but the floor in the back room was splintered and gaping. The chamber below had collapsed, burying whatever tunnels had existed. The chest was gone. To this day, locals say the farmhouse remains cursed. Hunters who pass by at night claim they see lantern light flickering in the windows, though the property has long been abandoned. Some swear they hear scratching when the wind is still. Others say if you press your ear to the ground near the back of the house, you can hear faint knocking, patient and deliberate, waiting for someone to answer. And in Ashford, no one dares to buy the property anymore. The land sits empty, the farmhouse sagging deeper into decay, its secrets sealed beneath the soil. But every so often, when the moon is high and the air is still, the town remembers what was found under that house. And they whisper of the terrifying discovery that was never fully explained, a reminder that some places are built on more than just earth and stone. Some are built on something far darker. When a town woke up to a nightmare, it began on a quiet Sunday morning in a small town tucked between rolling hills and winding country roads. The air was still, the sky pale gray, and a light mist clung to the edges of the fields. Most people were still asleep, their windows dark, their houses silent. But by the time the sun rose higher, no one in that town would ever feel safe again. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at dawn. A mail carrier driving along the main street noticed that nearly every door to the shops and houses stood wide open. At first, he thought maybe there had been a block party the night before, or that people were airing out their homes in the cool morning breeze. But then he realized the silence was unnatural. There were no footsteps on the sidewalks, no voices, no cars passing by. It felt like he was driving through a set of abandoned buildings rather than the heart of a living town. He parked his truck in front of the diner, a place that usually had the smell of bacon and coffee drifting out the door at that hour. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. Inside, plates of food sat untouched on tables, coffee still steaming in half-filled cups, chairs pushed back as if people had left in a hurry, but there was no one inside, not a single sound. By 7 in the morning, word spread quickly. Families waking up on the outskirts of town drove into the center, only to find the same thing, Stores unlocked, lights buzzing overhead, radios playing faint static, but no people. The sheriff arrived shortly after, called by a dozen frantic phone calls, his cruiser pulling into the empty main street. He tried to stay calm, telling people it could be a power issue, a gas leak, maybe even a prank, but he couldn't explain the details: why purses, wallets, and shoes had been left behind, why hot food sat uneaten, why every clock seemed to have stopped at exactly 2:14 in the morning. At 8 a.m., the town was buzzing with confusion. Families gathered together, some crying, some refusing to step foot into the center. A few of the men decided to search the streets more thoroughly. They went into the barber shop, the pharmacy, the small movie theater. Everywhere they looked, the story was the same places, frozen in time, abandoned in the middle of the night, as if hundreds of people had simply stood up and walked away in unison. When they reached the church, they found the pews empty, but hymnals scattered across the floor. A single candle still burned at the altar, its wax pooled into a puddle, but no one was inside. Outside, the sheriff stood with his radio pressed to his mouth, calling the state police, but the line was filled with nothing but static. The phones inside the diner, the offices, even the switchboard at the town hall were all dead. The fear began to spread like wildfire. Mothers clutched their children, fathers paced the sidewalks, muttering under their breath. The sheriff finally ordered that no one go inside the town alone. Small groups began to search, some heading toward the school, others into the residential blocks. At 9:30, a group of 3 entered a row of houses along Pine Street. The first house was neat and tidy, the front door hanging open. Breakfast sat half-eaten on the table, the back door unlocked, but no one was there. The second house had the same eerie silence. But when they reached the third house, they found something that made one of the men scream so loudly it echoed down the street. On the living room floor was a deep black stain, as if the carpet had been burned or melted in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle, they found a child's toy, a wooden train, charred black as if it had been exposed to fire. Yet nothing else in the room was burned. The walls, the furniture, even the magazines on the coffee table were untouched. The men ran back outside, pale and shaking, telling everyone what they had seen. Panic broke out. Some people wanted to leave immediately, to drive as far as they could, but when they tried, they discovered something even worse. Every road leading out of the town was blocked. Not by cars, not by fallen trees, but by something they couldn't explain. At the edge